Now, data is the new gold. This is a phrase that we've heard a lot over the last few years. However, in today's digital first and knowledge-based economy, having more data is not usually the answer. It's about being able to interpret and present it the right way so that it makes sense to decision makers and stakeholders. And this is where data storytelling comes in. And this also gets me so excited because it actually connects two worlds that are relevant to each other. It's the hard facts and it's also the human connection. And today we are joined by somebody who is specialized in data storytelling and visual communication. And I always say she also helps those boring industries and professions to turn their stats, they're usually boring, into very compelling stories and presentations. Kate Norris is in the house. Kate, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be back on your podcast.
I'm so excited because I've been following your journey for quite some time, and the nuggets that you drop on LinkedIn, the insights that you give on how we can actually turn different stats and data into really compelling visuals always fascinate me. So I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you.
To get us started, now everyone knows about storytelling. It's kind of this buzzword and everyone knows what it is and has been for a while. However, data storytelling, not so much. Can you give us an explanation or definition what data storytelling actually means?
Sure. So I think if you think about your data or even your knowledge, because knowledge is essentially data, if you think of it like one huge maze. So you know the mazes that we used to do as kids where you've got to find your way from one side to the other. If we think about data like that, the process of data storytelling is guiding someone from start to finish. Mm-hmm. So there's infinite places that we can go. We can go into detours or dead ends. There's lots of stuff to look at. But what we're doing is helping people go from one end to the other in a fairly straightforward manner.
I love it. And this is also what forces us to actually stick to the most important facts and don't get flustered with all the nitty-gritty details that are usually not relevant in the context of the presentation.
Yes.
Are there any certain situations or events where data storytelling is more effective and more efficient than in others?
I think when there is a lot of knowledge there, especially like in business, when you've got analysts who are looking at so much data, and businesses just have a phenomenal amount of data these days. It's impossible for everyone to understand exactly what's going on. And that's why we have analysts to find what is that data telling us. And this is their skill set. That is what they are trained to do, is to find what the data is saying. But then if we just communicate, just those graphs or essentially spit out more data, we're not communicating that insight and what is actually behind, what it actually means. It's essentially like reading another language and translating it into English.
Yes, absolutely. And, I remember when I got into recruitment and data analysts were hot commodity, the only thing that they needed to do, and I mean, it's quite a few years ago, it was to run reports, full stop. And now it has shifted into what you just said, translating it, making sense out of it, because this is where our human power actually comes in.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, when you use data storytelling, are there some key elements that we need to consider? Like, how do we analyze what kind of data to use, or how much or how relevant it actually is? Is there some guidance?
Yeah, this is probably the hardest part, is determining what you put in and what you leave out. And if you think of a story, even if we look at a movie, what's a movie that everyone's seen? I'm terrible with movies. Let's say like Harry Potter. Surely everyone's fairly aware of Harry Potter. The story that you actually get is not every piece of Harry Potter's life. We really essentially get just those years between when he starts school and when he finishes school. It's only over a 5 or 6 year period. There is some background that we need. We do need to understand what happens to him as a baby. We do need to understand some of that, but we're not spending a huge amount of time there. We're just choosing one small section of his life to tell that story. And it's the same when we've got our data. We just need to choose what section are we talking about. How do we give a little bit of that background? Because I have found with people, we can get really caught up in the background. And the feeling can sometimes be when someone's talking a lot about, the background, you can be like, come on, get on with it. What does this mean for me now? And what does this mean for me in the future? So in terms of how do we actually determine what was can you say the question again so I get the wording right? How do we determine
the elements to consider? So how much information and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to boil it down to two main things. The first is who is your audience, and what is your main message? So in terms of your audience, what do they currently know? What do they currently feel? And what do they currently do? You need to understand that, and then understand where you need to take them. What do you want them to know? What do you want them to feel? And what do you want them to do? That's so important, is to determine that, because that is going to be different for your CEO, which is going to be different from your CFO, which is going to be different from your COO. And I mean, that's the point of them having different jobs. They've got those different priorities. So you need to understand who you are speaking to so you can speak to their priorities. And then your message is going to be very short and simple and targeted towards them. Ideally, if you can get that down to one sentence, and that seems to blow people's minds, like, I've got too much data, I can't get it down to one sentence. We really need to try to. And it's possible. I've not yet had a discussion with someone that we haven't been able to get their entire message down to one sentence.
It just requires a lot more filtering through, thinking about it, and that's not easy. It's a lot easier to write a lot, to present everything there is, compared to what is the key essence of that. Yeah,
it takes work. It takes work to chip away at all the irrelevant data.
Absolutely. And this is what I love about your explanation also, that you said, who are we actually talking to? Because everyone's got different KPIs, different interests. What is in it for them when you present it? Not everyone needs to know everything there is. And this is, I think, where the power comes in, connecting the hard data with the human connection, the person behind who I'm actually presenting it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, everyone has different priorities, and so they should.
Yes,
we can't
absolutely.
expect them to have the same priorities.
Absolutely. Now, the next question would be, how do we actually translate those data into visual into a visual representation? Is there a way how we can go about it, how we can choose if it's better to put it into a graph or a chart, or when do we need to say this is a graph or a chart or a visual versus a headline?
Okay. So when I'm designing some sort of visual or a chart, the headline is your conclusion.
Ooh, I like it.
And then your visual becomes the backup to support that conclusion.
So good.
So if we're looking at, say, you've got a podcast, you're looking at your podcast data, or someone's presenting to you your podcast data, let's say, and they say that you have a graph and it says podcast listeners 2022. The questions that are going to go through your head are like, where are my podcast listeners located? How many are there? What time of day are they listening? What device are they listening on? Like, there's a million questions you can ask from that. Whereas if the chart came up instead and it said podcast listeners in March 2022 have increased 50% over the last year, then that's a conclusion. That gives you something to actually target your questions around, which is what made them increase, because that's what we're talking about, is that increase. And then your charts and your visuals are a backup for that statement of it's increased by however many percent. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one supports the other, basically.
Yeah. And if you can actually have some sort of action orientation in that headline, I gave a terrible example of, has increased by 82%. So maybe it should be, so you should continue producing whatever content is working well.
And I think this is the most powerful aspect actually of data presentation and visualization. It's not just it has increased, full stop. What's the next step? What's the conclusion of that? Is it good? Is it bad? What do we do from here?
And that's something that I really push in business, is this aspect of you've got to have a future focus. You've got to have a recommendation there, because otherwise it's still just data.
Yeah.
Like, it's increased by 50% is data.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Nobody can do anything with that.
Exactly. It might be in I'll call that even an insight.
Mm-hmm. And again, this is probably what comes back to being the translator. Who am I talking to, and what does it mean for them? So it has increased by 50%. To the CFO, it would mean we've gotten an increase in profit, for example, or a decrease of cost, or whatever it might be. For the content creator, it would mean let's produce more content with that type of topics, for example.
Yeah, for sure. And I sometimes get pushback from people who are a little bit more junior, like they might be at the start of their career, 5 or 6 years into their analytics journey, and they're like, it's not actually my place to give a recommendation. And I push back a lot on that, because I believe no matter what level you are, you need to be giving a recommendation. Because again, that's our job as data analysts, is to be future looking. It shows that you're willing to make that what's the word I'm looking for?
Like the conclusion or the next step, or you bridge the gaps.
You're willing to be future focused. You're willing to actually think a little bit further than just being a data monkey.
And I think this also comes down to being proactive and say, what do other industries proactive? But looking at what works and doesn't work in other industries or companies, and what would it mean to us? So simply doing a little bit more research behind that, saying, what does it even mean? Is it good? Is it an industry standard or not? It's not necessarily a personal experience or opinion on it. It's using more data to give a couple of recommendations, even to say, so we could actually do two things, A and B. And that doesn't mean either is right or wrong, and it's not your personal preference. It's literally these are the options. Full stop.
Yeah,
but it makes it easier.
Sometimes you will get pushback to say that's actually an incorrect recommendation for XYZ reason. But then if you've got an executive who says that won't work, the natural question is, well, what will? And it's going to spark that discussion of what should we do then. So even if your recommendation is wrong or is not going to work, it is still valuable, because it is a starting place for that conversation.
Absolutely. And it connects back to being proactive, saying, okay, so this won't work. So the next logical question would be, what will work? What can I present already to keep the conversation going and to actually get to a result? Because in the end, this is what we are here for. This is where, again, our human power comes in, that we think this step further and make sense of something that's not there yet.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that actually works really well for your personal brand, showing that you're willing to take the initiative and willing to make those recommendations. And also it puts you in the room where that conversation happens as well.
Absolutely.
And you get to then be a part of that discussion, and that's great for your own learning and to be 100%. Visible while that conversation's happening. I often talk about just by association, credit by association.
So good. And you are right, because everyone is so scared of making, quote unquote, the wrong recommendation, but the ones who are actually standing up for something and are known for addressing the hard issues sometimes, or playing the devil's advocate, this is healthy for an organization. It doesn't mean that we always have to be right. We just, stand up for something or question something that we're doing and why we're doing things. And you're right, it's perfect to build your personal brand. Yeah. Plus, it's leadership. In the end, it's going first before everyone else goes.
That's exactly right, yeah.
So everyone who wants to step up, we need to do something that the next level actually does before we have the official title to do it. And this is exactly what you just said, giving recommendations, being future focused, make it easy for others to understand what you actually do or what the data says. Now, I'm super curious, Kate. Are there different ways how we present data, the right or the wrong way, like pie charts over a diagram? How do we choose?
Okay, so with graphs, I think you can very easily split them into two categories, just two categories. There is graphs that you use to explore data, and there is graphs that you use to explain data.
Explore and explain.
So when you've got explore graphs, this is when you're analyzing. So what you're looking for then, you're looking for trends, you're looking for relationships between factors, you're looking for a lot of depth, and that takes training. That's the sort of thing that takes years of, it's basically learning to read the other language.
Mm.
And then when you move to the explain graphs, these are the really simple ones that everyone understands. So a very simple bar chart or a column chart with just one or two factors, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one that I really like is a line graph, if you've got something graphed over time. Occasionally, a pie graph. It's pretty trendy at the moment in the data biz community to hate on pie charts. There was a statement released by one of the people who is a leading expert in data biz. She wrote a big article and it was titled "Pie Charts Are Evil." And since then, it just took off because it's obviously very catchy. And from then, everyone kind of hated on pie charts. I don't love them, but sometimes they are appropriate. Mm-hmm. So I would say to people in general, if you think you need a pie chart, you probably need a bar chart. And if you're going to use a pie, you've got to have a really good reason. Those reasons absolutely exist, but you've got to have a really good reason for it.
What would be one of those reasons that would justify the pie?
Yeah, is purely comparing categories in terms of if you want to see something like market share. Let's talk about market share of Apple versus Android. So it doesn't necessarily matter what those numbers are, but you want to see that one's significantly bigger than the other. But if you are presenting like financial data when the specific numbers really matter, pie chart's not your go-to. Pie chart is good for getting like an overall feel for something.
Yes, absolutely.
So you want to know, like, is it about half? Is it about 3/4 and 1/4? Like whether the specific number doesn't matter.
Yes, gotcha. Now, the question is then, how do you actually ensure that you tell a story using those numbers? Because it says, yeah, one is bigger than the other, but it still doesn't necessarily tell a story.
Yeah. So I have a very simple structure that works for 90% of cases of data storytelling.
I love simple.
And that is, I'm a simple girl. Everything can be simplified.
It requires a lot of thinking though, so good on you.
It's taken a long time to get to simple, yeah.
Exactly.
And that is simple. If we can dump information into 3 categories, and that is past, present, future. So what do we need to put in background? What is like some context? What is happening now? What does this mean for us now? And then what does this mean for us in the future? Now, the data is going to mostly sit in the first 2, in the past and the present. And then your recommendations, your forecast is going to sit in that future category. But sometimes we see people who flick between, like, we should do this because this happened, and then we should do this because this happened, and we go back and forth between what's happening now, and it's really hard to make sense of it. So if you can just put, here's some background, here's what it means for us now, here's what it means for us in the future. It works really well.
It does, even when you just say that loud, it's so logical. We need some context to see where we are right now, but what does it mean in future? Full stop. You can't get lost in the maze.
I always feel bad sometimes when I explain it, because I think it feels so obvious. It feels so simple, and it really is. And I think out there's a lot of complication with storytelling. When you've got a story, you need to have characters, you need to have an arc, you need to have a climax. Like, that's really complicating it. And yes. I think it's to the detriment of storytelling, and especially to data storytelling. If you can just keep it simple, it works.
Absolutely. I love the 3 stages of a story. You've got context, that we know what it's actually about. Then you've got a challenge, and then you've got a learning and how you overcame it, or how you want to overcome it. full stop. There's, yes, the guides and the heroes and so forth. It makes it already complicated. And you're right, in a second it's too complicated, we're not doing it. And this is where we're getting confused and confusing others also with our stories and data.
Yeah, there's a really great Pixar storyline that all the Pixar movies use. And it's quite straightforward to use, but it takes a lot of time and energy. And you do it while you're doing the training for it, and you're like, this is great. And then when you go back to your desk and you have to put something together, it doesn't happen.
Exactly.
It just doesn't. Whereas with past, present, future, you can grab your sheet, you put 2 lines down it, so you've got 3 boxes, and it really is as simple as that. You don't have to have resources for it necessarily. You can just scribble it down and create that template on your page really simply, and it can actually be used.
Absolutely. And I think this is what makes this model or the system actually so powerful, because it doesn't require you to do a PhD, and everyone needs to get better with data storytelling, because we have to analyze more data, we have to pitch more often, we have to present no matter the level of role that we are in. So the easier it is for somebody to remember and put it into practice, the better the outcome is. Now, the question would be, are there any no-nos when it comes to data storytelling? What do we need to avoid?
Okay. The first one, and I think the most heinous crime, is assuming that you can wing it.
Ooh, what do you mean by that?
Thinking that I'll be right, I know my stuff. But the problem is, the more experienced that you are, the more years of knowledge that are crammed in your head, and the more difficult it is to find that through line. If we go back to that maze, like, you kind of know all the areas and you can take people on these detours and tell them all about this stuff, but you're not going to get to that end point. You need to map out your journey before you start. And it doesn't take that long to actually do. Like, if you just scribble a couple of notes down into past, present, future, and maybe, who am I speaking to? What are their priorities? It only takes 10 minutes of thought to write these things down. Who am I speaking to? What's my one message, that one sentence, and then background, that past. What's that mean for our current state, the present, and then what does that mean for us going forward? So people who think they can wing it are never as concise as people who have sat down and thought about it. They're not as engaging, and it's a lot more difficult to understand them, even though they might know more than anyone else about that subject.
And this is often where we assume, well, I know it, so it must be logical for everyone, else everyone would know it. And this is where we lose people along the journey. Yeah. And also, I reckon, one of the detriments actually in the business, because the more experienced and more knowledgeable we are, we think we know it all and we don't stay curious. And this is where the blind spots come in. And all of a sudden, events take over and the business is out of business.
Yeah. Because I think sometimes you can assume that people know more than they do as well, because you've spent, let's say 20, 30 years in that industry, that career, learning all of this stuff, and then you expect people to pick it up in 10 minutes. Like, well, it took you 30 minutes. Why do I have to learn it in 5 minutes?
Yeah, exactly. And this is also the whole idea of being a trusted authority, to be the translator of your technical knowledge in a way that makes sense. And this is where storytelling would come in, or using metaphors, so it's a little bit like all of a sudden everyone's on the same page, everyone's got the same image, and there's no confusion. And this is so powerful in today's world.
Yeah, for sure. That translator is a great analogy.
Are there any other no-nos? So assuming that everyone knows everything and we're not prepared and we can wing it is a big one. Anything else?
I would say presenting the data in the way that you use to explore it. So, I found this in this graph, and showing that explore graph, rather than taking the conclusion from that and what you found in that and putting it into an explain graph. So something that you might see a fair bit is like a line graph, and it's got 15 lines. and you're just trying to follow one line. Take that one line out and just put that one line by itself. That's all we're interested in. And just speak to just that explain graph.
Yes. Again, so powerful. Just do the thinking and take the guesswork out for everyone else, which requires this one tiny little step, but it makes all the difference how the message actually comes across.
That's it. Because you also want to focus people's attention on what you looked at. Because if you've got some people who, maybe they can read graphs pretty well, they're also going to be doing their own analyzing. And you don't want them to be doing that because you've done that and you've got the conclusion, you've got more background, more context. You want to be telling them what you found. You don't want to be making them analyze or even giving them the opportunity to come to their own conclusions, because sometimes they will come up with a completely different story to what you've got. And maybe they don't have all the information to support that, whereas you do. So it's taking that guesswork out of what other people are going to come up with and keeping them focused and their attention on what you want them to be focused on.
That's a really good point, because often it's like, oh, we've tried that before and it didn't work. Full stop. And an idea gets shut down, but there is no context why it actually didn't work. So you can direct them into the right way if you take out the guesswork up front.
Yeah, for sure.
Excellent. Now into the nitty and gritty, into the tools. Are there any favorite tools? Like, we all want to play with cool and fancy toys and tools. Are there any one that you prefer to use for different visualization techniques, and which ones are they?
I'm going to be awfully boring here, but when it comes to presenting data and telling a story with your data, it doesn't matter. I'm going to say PowerPoint, which it's a giant. Unfortunately, it is just the best. There is very, very little that it can't do that any other program can do. Microsoft are just phenomenal at their review system, and their update system is just, they've got their tentacles in just about every office in the world. And it's just a giant. So to me, I think it's like asking what's the best software to write a book. It doesn't really matter whether you use Scrivener or Microsoft Word or Notepad or a pen and paper. The substance is what matters, and every program will basically do what you need it to, whether that's, Tableau you can present, Power BI you can present. I know recently you're able to integrate Power BI into PowerPoint now, which makes sense because they're both Microsoft. And I think we need to be careful about getting caught up in the software, because you can spend a lot of time working out what's the best software to write a book. You just need to write a book.
Yes.
You need to write the chapters.
So true. There's a saying, what's the best tool? The tool you use, full stop.
That's it. And a lot of time can be spent. And Power BI and Tableau, they're the two giants. They've got massive marketing budgets, and they make you believe that you need their tool to visualize, to tell a story. And they are good, but they are not going to solve your problem.
Absolutely. And it doesn't do the heavy lifting for you. It's a supporting aid or a tool to actually tell the story. But who cares if it's a blue or a red chart in the end, or if it's super flashy or not? Yeah.
So look, PowerPoint's my go-to, or Keynote. Is that the Apple equivalent?
Yes, it is. That's been fascinating. I've learned so much. Took so many notes. Now I'm curious, what's next for you? How do you actually work with teams and leaders? What's ahead for you, Kate?
So we do training mostly and upskilling people on how to tell their stories with their data. And what we're moving into, what we're being asked to do more and more, is help people actually completely revamp their reports. So annual reports, financial reports, like monthly reports, and just get that groundwork done, because again, learning how to do it and implementing that, especially when you've got a deadline, can be really difficult. So that's really what we've been moving into, is helping people completely redo their reports and making them look really fancy, getting that template there so that when they go to use it next month, it's all there ready to use and looks fancy and looks great, and also tells a really strong story, which again is the most important factor there.
Oh, absolutely. And I love that it's kind of the mission to disrupt financial reports because they're so boring and so long and nobody cares. But again, they're so powerful if you present them the right way.
Yeah. I've just done a really great project where we have a financial report that they're not allowed to change. So instead, we created a slide pack that this financial controller can actually use to explain that graph. That's the graphs on the report. And so people sit there and they are explained it through PowerPoint, and they sit there with their report and they can actually properly understand it. It was a really interesting project, and I would like to move into that area more because I think that's a really powerful way to do it when you've got a lot of limitations.
Absolutely, and needed.
Yeah,
well needed. I think more than ever before, because we've never had so much data and access to information than ever before, and we are tired of information and things and all the disruption and disturbance. Yeah, excellent. Absolutely. Now, what's the best way to connect with you, learn more, how you can actually support companies and teams? Where should everyone go?
Either connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm quite active on LinkedIn. I'll just be under Kate Norris. And otherwise, my website, presentationboss.com.au. Excellent.
I'll put all the links in the show notes because honestly, highly recommend to connect with Kate and also learn how to present and tell data the right way. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Petra.